This next piece is only a small extract of a very long poem called The Prelude by William Wordsworth, who was one of the first of the Romantic poets. Typical of Wordsworth, the poem conveys an experience in which the speaker is irrevocably changed by nature. An experience of nature which touches and transforms the speaker's soul in a way. A theme of reflection, therefore, permeates the poem. And in terms of power and conflict, it represents the human position in nature, or our comparative powerlessness in nature. How compared to nature, we humans are nothing. We will read the poem and discuss what it's about. We will think about its context before annotating the poem. And finally, we will think about the other poems you could compare it to in the anthology. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight, I unloosed her chain and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shapes towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There, in her mooring place, I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts, there hung a darkness, call it solitude, or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So, what is happening in this poem? This poem details a childhood experience of Wordsworth's, when he stole the boat and rowed it out into the middle of a lake. And the surrounding lake, and in particular a mountain nearby that rises up, it makes him feel dwarfed and insignificant in comparison. The whole experience leads him to contemplate things he'd never contemplated before, these unknown modes of being. And it completely changes how he sees nature. He realizes how superior and incomprehensible nature is for humans. And this experience haunts him for a long time. This is, as I mentioned, an extract from a very long poem called The Prelude, an epic poem comprising 14 books, which Wordsworth spent a lot of his life writing. Obviously, the title raises questions. What is it meant to serve as a prelude to? It was intended to be the prologue for an even longer epic work called The Recluse, which unfortunately Wordsworth died before finishing. And the final version of The Prelude was only published 3 months after his death in 1850. This segment, the moment of stealing the boat, is based on an event of Wordsworth's childhood in the Lake District where he was born. And the Lake District is an area of England that really inspired Wordsworth. One of his most famous poems, sometimes referred to as Daffodils, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, was written in the Lake District. Wordsworth is one of the most prominent Romantic poets. We must be a little bit wary of that term, which was coined by a literary critic to describe a number of poets grouped together for not necessarily the most obvious reasons. And don't confuse romantic for romantic love. That's not what's meant when referring to romantic poets. In poetry, romanticism was a movement that turned towards nature and the internal self. It prioritizes the individual and human emotion and feeling. The Romantic movement could be seen as a reaction against the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The more spiritual, emotional components of Romantic poetry, often alternative to the line of Enlightenment thought that emphasized reason over superstition and science over faith. Another key contextual factor is, as it was for Blake, the Industrial Revolution, or the plague of industrialization, as some of them might have seen it, that saw the birth of factories and rapidly expanding cities that threatened the natural world. Poems like the Prelude could be seen as a warning. Their focus on the superiority of nature warns against the dismantling of nature in the name of progress. What stands out in that opening line, one summer evening led by her? This parenthesis is interesting because we wonder, who is her meant to be? Is it meant to be some sort of personification of Mother Nature? It leads us to think, especially the fact that it's in parentheses, the fact that it's in brackets, it makes us think that whoever she is, she has a subconscious influence over the speaker, and she is therefore responsible for this later epiphany that he has throughout the poem. So the parenthesis implies a subconscious influence over the speaker, leading us to think that she might be responsible for the later epiphany. So he sees this little boat, you have this image of this little boat lying there. It was an act of stealth, so we know that he is stealing the boat. Is this perhaps then an early sign of his arrogance before he has been humbled by nature? And then you have this wonderful troubled pleasure. This is oxymoronic. Remember, an oxymoron is when two words with an opposite meaning are put together, for example, bittersweet. And every single oxymoron would be an example of juxtaposition when two things are placed next to each other to highlight the difference between them. If you're not sure that it's specifically an oxymoron, which is when you have these two words with opposite meanings next to one another, you can always describe it as oxymoronic as an adjective. The act of stealing is giving him pleasure, but he knows that it's wrong. That oxymoronic phrase is showing that the conscience of the speaker is being troubled by the stealing of this boat. Leaving behind her still on either side. So leaving behind the boat, you have this beautiful imagery, small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted it all into one track of sparkling light. It really is a beautiful image there. Notice throughout this, you have this contrast between light and shade, between stillness and movement, as you'll see here, but now like one who rows. And the movement here, he is the one rowing across this smooth, still lake. But now like one who rows, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line. Could this be a comment on humanity and humanity's uncompromising fixation on progress? Potentially, that's what that could be alluding to, that he is embodying that attitude and uncompromising fixation on progress. Remember, this is the period of the Industrial Revolution. Is that what that's referring to? And far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. Again, this stillness, this being one with nature. She was an elfin pinnace. A pinnace here is a boat. So there's a boat with this sort of mythical quality. And actually also, I think this connects back to this being led by her, drawing him onwards towards this epiphany. And you might disagree, but there is this underlying sense of danger that's being led by her. She, and we assume she is Mother Nature, is drawing him on. Underlying sense of danger, and he's heaving through the water like a swan. That's an interesting simile because it's coupled with heaving, and we don't associate heaving with swans. Swans have streamlined, elegant movement, but then of course you have the swan's legs working tirelessly underneath the surface. So we could be thinking, okay, what does he mean by that simile? And we move now from the lake to landscape that takes on human form. And so suddenly he's drifting across this lake, and this is when you have this moment that actually is somewhat terrifying to the speaker. From behind that craggy stilp till then, the horizon's bound, and notice he's mentioned this craggy steep in the distance. He's building up this suspense a huge peak, black and huge. You have repetition here. What is the effect of the repetition here? I think it could almost mean words have failed him. He can't think of a synonym in that moment of huge or of big or enormous. That's all. A huge peak, black and huge. He's lost the ability to speak. All he can take in, all he can notice is the immensity of the mountain, the size of the mountain. And then we have this moment, as with voluntary power instinct, power is entering here. Remember, it's about the overwhelming power of nature. This huge peak that's rising up, it becomes personified, upreared its head. But it's in the poet's imagination. That's important to note, because it's terrifying to him. This instinctual, innate power that nature has, and that is what the speaker is witnessing and truly appreciating for the first time. I struck and struck again, so he's afraid. That's how he's acting back, and that's that repetition, that same loss for words. All he can do is strike with the oars, and this huge thing towers up between me and the stars. Nothing but the stars and the grey sky that's mentioned earlier, that is now being blocked out. So this huge peak is blocking out the light of earlier. With purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, this personification continues, strode after me. The sense of being chased. We all know that feeling, don't we? Of being chased by something that's terrifying us. The sense of being chased, pursued, is intensified by this caesura here. And this time, instead of stealing towards, he is stealing, the speaker is stealing away, he's stealing back. And in terms of then the structure of this extract, this is becoming somewhat cyclical, because he stole away and now he's stealing back, but everything has changed when he's coming back. Back to the covert of the willow tree, he's seeking refuge. That's how terrified he feels when confronted with the power of this nature. And he leaves the boat and he heads home. That's the event. We then get the aftermath of the event, how much he is haunted. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, so it's showing the impact of this experience, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. I love this line. Here we are touching on the sublime. Remember, the sublime refers to an awe-inspiring quality that cannot be quantified, that cannot be measured. Unknown modes of being, there's something about this experience of nature that is inexplicable. We're touching on the inexplicable, the unknown, what is beyond man's comprehension, beyond human experience, being completely overpowered, unknown modes of being, something he doesn't understand, something that has hitherto been unknown. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, another beautiful bit. Call it solitude or blank desertion. Blank desertion, complete emptiness. That's the effect that this experience has had on him. And call it solitude. Wordsworth is known for solitude. I wandered lonely as a cloud. And often solitude, well, there can be comfort in solitude, but actually there doesn't seem to be any comfort in this. This is him entirely alone. I feel like this somewhat resonates with modern readers, in that it's so hard in our modern day and age to find solitude, to find a moment of being completely alone. Everything is changed for him then. No familiar shapes remained. Everything is changed, and nothing comforts him. It's such a powerful ending to this poem. No familiar shapes remain, no pleasant images of trees. None of that can exist for him because his entire perspective has shifted. He understands now that man is powerless against nature. And if we're thinking about the structure, look at all of this end from bark onwards. Compared to the rest of the poem, look at all the line endings. It's all become enjambment and caesura. And that mirrors how the usual order has been disrupted by his epiphany, how he can't see things in the same way. And that's reflected in the line endings themselves. All of the enjambment, remember the lines trickling over to the next lines, and caesuras reflect how the usual order has been disrupted by his epiphany. And this is all he's left with, huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men. Another wonderful line. Again, beyond our comprehension, that are above us, that man is powerless against. These huge and new mighty forms, now he understands nature to be, they haunt him both by day and by night. He ruminates constantly about them. He thinks about them constantly during the day, and he's haunted to them by night. We have the experience of the speaker being completely and utterly humbled by what he has witnessed, and understanding that man is powerless against nature. In terms of this, he takes the boat out, and then he has to retreat. He must retreat in the face of nature, for it could be described as somewhat of a numinous experience that leaves him completely humbled. Think about the journey the speaker has gone on from the beginning of the poem, when he is this somewhat arrogant young man who wants to go out and appreciate nature, feels entitled enough to steal a boat, and then is confronted by the magnitude, the immensity of the power of nature around him. And that leads him to be completely humbled. So, which poems in the Power and Conflict anthology could you compare the Prelude to? You could compare it to Ozymandias, because both poems highlight the limitations of humanity in comparison to the limitlessness of nature. In both poems, nature is far more powerful than mankind. However, they do this in different ways. Wordsworth uses an individual experience of being transformed and dwarfed by nature, whereas Shelley highlights the illusory perception a long-dead king had of his own power. You could compare it to Kamikaze, because both recognize the power and influence of nature over humanity, and the speakers in both poems undergo a shift in perspective in the face of nature. But while there is personal conflict in both poems, these come from different places. In the Prelude, the speaker grapples with his comparative insignificance, whereas in Kamikaze, the inner conflict stems from challenging the unquestioning patriotism that drives kamikaze pilots to meet their end in the name of their country. Finally, you could compare it to Storm on the Island, because both poems present nature as a force to be reckoned with. Heaney, however, shows the physical, literal power of a storm, whereas the power nature wields over man in the Prelude is much more psychological. I hope this was helpful for your understanding of this extract from the Prelude. It is a beautiful poem, a quintessential romantic poem, really, that proves romantic poetry isn't meant to be light and fluffy and pretty. It deals with complex and profound human emotions. And I think many can identify with the speaker of the poem, because many have had a numinous experience in nature when you are confronted by your own insignificance in comparison. And Wordsworth captures that perfectly.